interesting point than I can. So I think the discussion will itself present this work. A quick introduction to the scholars, to the panelists who do not need introduction actually. Very distinguished scholars. We're very fortunate to have them here. Professor Harish Trivedi, I think a very well-known scholar. I don't know what I can say, but former professor of English at University of Delhi. He is a scholar of post-colonial literature, translation studies, translator, literary critic, and has been, of course, scholar and fellow and visiting professor at various universities around the world. We also have Professor Asim Siddiqui with us, Professor of English in Aligarh Muslim University. And he also has quite an exhaustive list of publication. I was just looking at his publications, and it includes various journals, writings, book chapters, articles, and so on. Books such as Jahan-e-Said 2017 and Believing and Belonging, Critical Essays on British Muslim Fiction 2016. And interestingly, he also writes columns on arts and culture in various magazines and newspapers. With this, I would like to start the event without any delay, and I would request Professor Harish Trivedi to put forward his point and begin the discussion, perhaps followed by Professor Siddiqui, and then Professor Rahman can answer and make his point. But I would also like to leave the way the discussion flows completely free to the panelists, and please proceed as you find it suitable and as it moves forward. So with that, I think I would like to hand over to you all, and please, I would like you to request to start the discussion.
Shraddhanjali, did you say that I have to go first?
I thought you could.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify whether we'll all speak in just one round or one short round in the beginning and then one or two rounds again to follow.
Yes. So
Right?
I thought you could start followed by Asim sir, and then Professor Rahman can respond, and then again you can have a to and fro between the three of you.
Wonderful. Yeah, so the first thing to say is that this book here, in case some of you haven't yet seen it, it's a marvelous book. And the second thing to say is that the earlier book by Anis, which was Hazaron Khwaishein Aisi, the Hazar Rang Shairi for me is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me, or is the link gone?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, we can hear you. Please carry on.
Right. Okay. Because, I see some. Oh, right. Somebody was trying to put on the cover of the book. Because I think the way I put it on might not have been correct or might not have been enough. Yeah. So I'm very glad that formally it's here. What I was going to say before technology intervened was that I must be extremely fortunate that I've been invited. I'm also, of course, greatly honored that I've been invited to speak at on this panel about this book, just as I was very fortunate to be invited at the launch of the earlier book, Hazaron Khwaishein Aisi, at a function at that great festival, Rekhta, with Anis Bhai. I'm looking forward to the third book of his in a similar line. He's published many other books before, so that, never mind him, so that I can complete my hat trick of speaking on his books of Urdu Shairi in translation. I'd also suggest to him that the time may soon come when he will progress beyond Hazaron to Lakhon. There may be Lakhon Urdu verses that I think he's already translated or is certainly going on to translate. There are 70 poets in this volume, and there were 65 in the earlier volume, Haldan Khwahishein Aisi, and at that launch I suggested that he stopped at 60. Of course, there are hundreds of Urdu poets. I suggested that he stopped at 65 because 65 is the age of retirement, at least for professors. But I hear that there are some universities which go on to 70. So now he has stopped at 70. And I hope the retirement age keeps on going up so that include more and more poets. But the wonderful thing about this volume is that it introduces the reader to aspects of Urdu poetry that most people, even those who claim to love Urdu and its poetry, and those who have been reading it for a long time, and those who can even recite a number of Urdu verses with great fondness, even they may not be fully aware of. Therefore, it extends the knowledge of even Urdu lovers, long-standing Urdu lovers, in a way that I think is utterly remarkable. It did so in my own case. I have loved Urdu Shairi ever since the age of 14. In 1961, I spent 1 rupee and bought a book published by Hind Pocket Books called Diwan-e Ghalib, edited by Prakash Pandit. That's how my love of Urdu began in 1961. It's more than 60 years since then, and Urdu has been a constant companion, not only poetry but also prose. And yet, the first thing I wish to emphasize is that I thought I knew the difference between ghazal and nazm. But it turns out, after reading his introduction particularly, that actually I did not. Most people believe, I'm talking of WhatsApp people now, people who only use WhatsApp and get their information of the whole world from WhatsApp. Most people don't even know the difference between ghazal and nazm. They've only heard of ghazal. And judging by WhatsApp, most people think that all the couplets in Urdu, all the sher, all the ashar were written either by Ghalib or by Gulzar. There is no third poet for them because these are the names that come up all the time. Now, not only there are some people still at that basic level, but even those who are far advanced will learn such a lot about the various forms of Urdu poetry. I thought, for example, and I hope that some of you at least will share it, that I'll be the only ignoramus amongst this assembly. I thought that there was ghazal and there was nazm, and then there were things like masnavi and qasida and sehra and shehra shog and so on. But now I find that they can all be called nazm. Anis calls all of them nazm. They're all included within nazm. And what is even more amazing is that within the word nazm, within the label nazm, he also includes things like doha and sonnet and even haiku. So the conception of nazm has not only expanded, but absolutely exploded in my mind. And he names, of course, a number of other forms of Urdu poetry, which many of us may not have heard of and certainly are not acquainted with directly or in translation, like hajv, satire, and lampoon. So it's a really mind-expanding book, especially the introduction. It's amazing. I mean, even, as I said, even lovers of Urdu will find many, many new things in it. He begins further back than most people think Urdu began, because there was Dakhni in the south, and he includes Dakhni, and he begins with that in the 16th century, if not the 15th century, with Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah. And there are, of course, as always, many points to dispute between Urdu and Hindi. And there are some people who think that Hindi has as valid a claim to Dakkini as Urdu does, but I don't agree with them. I think that Urdu has a much stronger claim to calling Dakkini its own, partly because Urdu begins with Dakkini. We cannot take anybody's parents away from them. Hindi begins further back, and therefore Hindi is okay. Hindi can do without Dakkini. The other thing is that words like Bhautik Maya occur in the very first poem here that's been translated. Bhautik Maya. Now, most people may be inclined to call that Hindi, but no. Look at the surrounding words. Look at the whole tone. Look at the whole ethos. And you will acknowledge that it is very largely Urdu and the beginning of Urdu at least. So, the expanse of Urdu poetry in terms of genre, generically, also thematically, is absolutely marvelous in this volume. Many people will learn a lot more about Urdu poetry from this volume than from even the earlier volume of Urdu ghazals presented by Anis. And that is because ghazals are far more familiar in translation, in Hindi, in English, in many languages of the world. And Nazm in all its many varieties is not. So that's the first thing to say. One or two more things about the organization. I love the way Anis has divided his massive anthology into several parts. And I enjoyed particularly, I'm fascinated by the titles that he's given them, the different parts, Making a Tradition. And then around page 66, already in this 500-page book, around page 66, he already goes to the next section, which is towards modernism. That fascinated me. Already we are in the 20th century because he defines the modern period, this early modern period, as between 1850 and 1950, which is very right, because those who were born in 1850 are still writing in the 20th century. Most of the poets here, there are hardly anybody who died in the 19th century. They wrote in the 19th and the 20th. So we are very much into the modern period. But I'm not sure, Anis has reinvented these familiar phrases, terms for Urdu particularly, and why not? Modernism and also postmodernism. In English, I think they're used in a slightly different sense. But of course, why can't Urdu appropriate them in its own sense? Then progressive poetics. The progressive poets are put together in a separate section. I'm assuming that not everybody has seen the book. And therefore, the first thing is to introduce it at this level before we talk about the subtler aspects, and also thus to make it more inviting for people who still haven't got a copy. Not everybody is going to get a free copy, let me tell you. Only those who speak on this panel. So please go out and get a copy of the book. There are progressive poets, and after that, there's new poetics. This is a parallel to the development in many languages, many Indian languages. There is Pragativad, as in Hindi, for example, and then there is Nai Kavita. So we have progressive poetics, and then we have new poetics, and then there's a fascinating section called Beyond New Poetics. If you have called something already new, what do you call the next thing? You call it beyond. And beyond has one other sense also. The Beyond New Poetics, I can't be sure, but I think it's true, are all from Pakistan. And Anis clarifies that the Nazm achieved a new kind of richness in Pakistan. And the last section is called Womanist, Feminist Poetics. And there are, I think, 14 poets, 14 women poets, who all fill and adorn this last section. I'm not going to go into what women may think about being put last rather than first, or rather than in the middle together with the others. But this is as neat a way of organizing the whole thing. And at the end of it, at the end of the book, all the Urdu original texts are also provided in Roman transliteration. It's wonderfully put together book. And the introduction is called Frames of Reference. The introduction to the form of the Nazm will be informative to everyone except the greatest Urdu scholar, which means all of us here, except one or two people perhaps. But I will not end this round without a little gila shikwa, without a little complaint, which is a very personal thing, which is that there's a poet particularly dear to me, partly because he comes from my city, my own city, but partly also because I think most people would agree that he is among the top 6 poets ever to have written in Urdu. And he wrote nazms in the sense of long poems which are not ghazals. He revolutionized the Urdu Rubai, which is again a part of the nazm according to Anis. And he's not here at all. So on behalf of myself, on behalf of my beloved city, Allahabad, I protest. This man is Firag Gorakhpuri. Either for Rubai or for the long nazm like Adhi Raat, like Jugnu, like Hendola. These are some of the greatest poems in modern Urdu literature. But I'm sure that Anis Bhai will give us such a splendid and persuasive reason for not including him here that we'll all be left speechless. Thank you.
Should I?
Would have, yeah.
Yes, Asim sir, I think.
That's the batting order. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I must also thank Jadavpur University and of course Comparative Literature Department for having me on this panel with such distinguished people as Harish Trivedi sir. And of course, it is always a pleasure to interact with Anisur Rahman sir. I feel honored. Thank you very much. Harish Saab has already made some very valid points, and it is difficult to disagree with him. So I won't take that risk. I won't, in fact, add anything new if I repeat those points. So maybe I can talk about something else. First of all, I must say that only a professor of English who has a sense of style, who can use crisp expressions, who can write precise prose, could have written this book. And Anis Saab is known for his crispness of style, his precision. When I am emphasizing the crispness of expression, I also have many books actually written in Urdu. Often when we read Urdu books, or for that matter, even Hindi books, I feel that sometimes too much space is taken to make a few points. So that way, this particular style was needed to present such a long trajectory, which Anis Saab has covered. That means from 16th century to the present. Now, this crispness can be seen not only in his introduction, but also in short introductions of various poets that he has written about. And I am emphasizing this point. You read the description of any poet here, and you see that Anis Saab uses just one or two phrases, one or two defining qualities of that poet, and you get a very good picture of that poet. In fact, of the entire corpus of that poet's work. Obviously, he has chosen only 2 nazms from a big corpus that a poet can have. Say, for example, if I talk about one poet who I know intimately, Shahryar, for example, or for that matter, Zahida Zaidi, who come from the same city. In fact, I also shared the same space with them. So Anis Saab, or for that matter, Munibur Rahman Saab, so he uses some defining qualities, and just in one or two words, you get the essence of that poet's work. So, for example, Munibur Rahman Saab is known for his enigmatic quality. There is an enigmatic quality in his poetry. And if you know something about Ismail Merathi, then he's a poet of children, for example. He has written for children. Josh Maliabadi, we know him as a revolutionary poet also, but we also know that he wrote a very famous book, Yadon Ki Barat, which was also controversial. And Anis Saab uses just two words, say his blend of fact and fiction, his controversial blend of fact and fiction. So this also brings the whole picture of Yadon Ki Barat. Meera ji, for example, he was not only influenced by some indigenous sources, but also by Baudelaire. And if you think about Majid Amjad, then his individual and collective memories, how he represents individual and collective memories. Now just capturing the entire essence of a poet's work in just 2-3 sentences, that is remarkable. It needed Anis Saab's years of study. I'm reminded of the work of a sociologist who talked about his work, and actually the approach was summed up in one sentence. The sentence was years of analysis for a movement of synthesis. Years of analysis for a movement of synthesis. That means if Anis Saab could use these 2-3 words, then behind that, there was a long experience, not only with the tradition of Urdu poetry, but also familiarity with the corpus of all these individual poets. For example, Munir Niazi, and he's also very famous on WhatsApp. But how does Anis Saab introduce Munir Niazi? He is an important images poet. And see his language also, the language. And students of literature can also learn something about the idiom in which we can write about poetry. His subdued tone, for example, his restrained manner. And similarly, when we talk about Shahryar, and we know that when we are talking about poetry, we are not talking about paraphrasing poetry. We are also talking about its tonal quality. And Shahryar is a poet of bewilderment, curiosity, and he's always asking questions, Shahryar. So that bewilderment, that curiosity is very much there. And if I can select one particular description, which I'll consider a classic in just one page, how Anis Saab has presented the entire world of Adil Mansoori. That is an excellent description, so just one page. And of course, Ali Sardar Jafri. We all know Ali Sardar Jafri. But how Anis Saab describes Ali Sardar Jafri, his poetry presents a kind of solidarity and need to connect. There is an element of solidarity and a need to connect. So that means here this book is not only important for the selection, it is also important how Anis Saab has used few words and he has presented the entire world of a poet. A few other things also, because at the end, Anis Saab has also provided a transliteration key, which is also very important. That means sometimes when you read Urdu in Roman script, you can go wrong as far as pronunciation is concerned. And Harish Saab made a very important point that even those who know Urdu, even those who profess a love of Urdu, they also need to learn various nuances of Urdu. So for example, this transliteration key is extremely important because Urdu poets are very particular about use of sounds. They are very particular about how those words are pronounced, how they are emphasized, and in what manner you read them. And in fact, it is not only Urdu poetry. Many aspects of poetry, for example, irony or bewilderment that you can see in English, they also depend a great deal on how something is recited. But because Urdu also has some sounds which are not there in English, or rather, if we use structuralist vocabulary, then many of those sounds are not recognized as bringing about a kind of change in meaning, or they are not meaning making sounds in English. Say, for example, ha sound, khas, takhallus. And here I want to give one example how these sounds are so important. In the last 4 days, actually, I saw Muzaffar Ali's Umrao Jan. And I also saw Datta's Umrao Jan, where Aishwarya Rai played Umrao Jan. And I can tell you that Rekha got each and every sound of Urdu. And you know that Umrao Jan actually was based on Shahryar's poetry. The entire character of Umrao Jan was conceptualized through Shahryar's poetry. So that means poetry was central to the meaning of that film, and so was the sound. So Rekha got all those sounds perfectly right. Aishwarya Rai got most of those sounds wrong. And in fact, I am reminded of one very interesting sentence. Muzaffar Ali asked Javed Akhtar, how did Aishwarya Rai grapple with Urdu sounds? And Javed Akhtar said, खुदा जब हुस्न देता है तो उर्दू आ ही जाती है. खुदा जब हुस्न देता है तो उर्दू आ ही जाती है. So that means there, this transliteration key is extremely important. And any book demands some work on the part of the reader. Any book demands some labor also on the part of the reader. And I think if readers of this book just pay some attention to this transliteration key, then probably they can profit much more. And I must tell you that when I was reading the Roman version, sometimes to check the translation, then I found it very difficult also to read, especially those dots and those capital letters where KH or RH or CH, those letters were written. So that can be very irritating also when we read that. But that is also rewarding, especially for those readers who are not familiar with Urdu sounds. So maybe for many of us who are familiar with Urdu sounds, these translation, these symbols may not be important. But for others who are grappling with those sounds, those symbols are important. Then, of course, another very important thing about this poem is Anis Saab's translation. And here also, I'll just make one point. Sometimes the translator has to decide if he should use rhyme or he should not use rhyme. Because rhyme poses limitations also. Because the translator cannot have access to many words if he is thinking about the rhyme. But rhyme is also important. So this is a choice. Somebody like Ralph Russell, who translated Ghalib, he does not believe in using rhyme. But Anis Saab used rhyme in his earlier book also, which Harish Saab referred to, Hazaro Khwahish Aisi. And in this book also, Anis Saab has used rhyme wherever it was necessary, because I feel that it was important for him to use that rhyme. Now here one can read especially his Marcia, his translation of his translation of Anis, and he has used rhyme there beautifully. And of course, there is another very important aspect of this book, which Trivedi Saab mentioned, various genres or sub-genres of Nazm. Sir, I also did not have fair idea of all these genres because I had heard all these terms, not all these terms. Some terms were new for me also. With Sehra, we are familiar with Doha, but it never occurred to me that these are all forms of Nazms. So that way it is a major contribution to Urdu Nazm. And I must say, it is an excellent reference book. In fact, your earlier book was also an excellent reference book. I always keep a copy of that book on my bedside table, because whenever I need anything for a ready reference, then that book is there. And this book, as Harisa pointed out, it is even more ambitious, and it is even more important because it covers long trajectory. Classification, of course, is also kind of interpretation, and Anis Saab will also tell us something more about this classification. And another interesting thing, and that also probably requires a detailed intervention from Anis Saab. In his section on womanist poets, there are only two poets, that is Professor Zahida Zaidi and Professor Sajda Zaidi. So I was wondering if there are any more women poets from India. And another question, actually, Anis Saab has also, in fact, presented number of Pakistani poets, Pakistani Urdu poets, and sometimes in India we are not very familiar with the scene in Pakistan, especially poetry in Pakistan, because either through WhatsApp or through Facebook posts, or through different ways, through different channels, we get to know Indian poets, Indian Urdu poets, or by personal interaction. So that is also one very important aspect of this book, that number of Pakistani poets. Of course, Munir Niazi is famous, but there are many more important names here. And again, a point Anis Saab will probably talk about this. In English, in fact, this debate between modernism and postmodernism, where modernism ends and where postmodernism begins, and whether postmodernism or modernism, they are simply styles, or they are periods, or they are tempers, that is also far from settled. And now, in fact, we are discovering many modernist writers who are also, in fact, considered postmodernist, and Joyce is kind of a classic case in this. So that way, this particular question, who we consider postmodernist, especially in Urdu, modernist is fine, but who we consider postmodernist, here I think it was a very let me say it was a kind of interpretation. It was classification, but it was also an interpretation by the author. And I think that is enough. And Anis Saab, I can come in later also if need.
Yashwantanjali, may I come in now?
Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Okay. Let me first begin with a word of thanks to both the speakers. Professor Trivedi, whom I always call Harish Bhai, and I take great pleasure in saying so. Professor Trivedi is very formal. He has been for a long time now my elder brother, and I've sought lots of say ideas and say experiences that he shared with me and I shared with him. So always an elder brother. Thank you, Harish Bhai, for your input. Thank you, Asim Saab, for your very interesting points that you made. So apart from thanking you both, and I have to thank you enough, I can't really thank you enough. One has to say a word of thanks and gratitude to the Department of Comparative Literature, because without their intervention and without their making a choice for this kind of a book, probably we couldn't have met on this platform. And I can see lots of people, around 100 are present here, which makes me extremely happy that the book has reached to so many people today, this evening. I'm very grateful to Dr. Sayantan Dasgupta, with whom I talked about this book about 2 months ago when I was in Kolkata, lecturing in a college there. And for a personal reason, I had been there. So since then, one has been talking about, and it's the day that has finally come, and we are talking about the book today. Makes me extremely happy. Thanks to Sayantan Dasgupta, the colleagues in the department there, and those who are present here. what Harish Bhai said, I agree with most of the points that he has made, because you can't disagree with him in any case. But apart from that, these are very relevant points that he has made, which really gives you a very clear picture of what I have tried to do in this book. And not only in this book, but both the books taken together. Friends, my whole idea was, whether I succeeded or I didn't, the whole idea was to present two huge windows to Urdu poetry to the readers in the English language. And it so happened that I was once preparing a bibliography for a research paper of how many Urdu texts have been translated, especially poetry I'm talking about, how many Urdu poets have been translated. And I could lay my hands upon several sources, and finally I found that about 150 poets plus were translated into the English language. But not a single book that could give you an idea of the trajectory of Urdu poetry right from the 16th century to now. So my idea was to present a larger view of this poetry, because saying this from this platform of the Comparative Literature, Indian Literature and Translation Department in Jadavpur, this makes very particular sense to me, very clear sense to me, and I hope to you too. Because how do you place and how do you contextualize this literature unless you take the entire trajectory in hand? So I thought that let me take this huge responsibility of putting all these traditions together. The Ghazal tradition in one poet, in one book, which is Hazaro Khwahish 2019, Harper. And then after this, Hazar Rang Shairi this year, that is December, 3 months before. So that was the idea, Harish Bhai. You talked about the kinds of nazm. Yes, I also didn't know of the so many, but when you write a book, you research into that. And then I came to know that there were, in my book, I have talked about 19 forms of nazm. And one very clear thing that the audience might like to know, that ghazal is just one form that you know all about that. That it's a 2-line composition, it's known as a sher, and there are 5-6 shers in it, and each sher is different from the other, and it's very musical, and it's known for its quality of musicality. But when it comes to nazm, many people answer, many people don't really know what is nazm. So nazm is all kinds of poetry written in the Urdu language other than ghazal. And I traced that about 18 forms and 18 types of ghazal. Then the second point I found out was very interesting, that there were so many metrical constructions that the poets used. So it was not just 1 meter. And it was huge representation, cultural representations and religious representations and secular representations. So that is how it went. So you talked about the Dakkani and the role of Urdu and the share of Urdu. Well, one has to agree with that, and how Hindi comes into it, and the coming of Rekhta. So all these things were a part of the discussion that I was engaging with. The title of the section you talked about, and Asim Siddiqui Sahab also talked about the titles and about the period. I have not based my titles or the periodization, as you call it in technical terms, on any literary history book. This is purely my periodization. This is how I look at the trajectory of Urdu poetry. You might say that there is an overlap in the last 3 sections when I talk of modernism and beyond modernism, and the last section, and then I talk of the women poets. So you will see that there is some kind of overlap. So this overlap is clearly there, because Urdu nazm, as it has been evolving, I understand that it's evolving every day. It hasn't died. It is not exhausted at all. And it's in the process of being and becoming every day. And that is how it is reaching new destinations. So the title of this section, I try to think on my own and try to develop my own idea of how the trajectory of Urdu nazm just moves forward. One question has been raised about all poets from Pakistan, that in a particular section that Professor Trivedi said. Yes, of course, and Asim Saab also mentioned. That is one thing one can talk about a little later, maybe when that time comes. As for example, the important point that Professor Trivedi made is the Gila Shikwa about Firaq. Very true, very true. I did lay my hands upon the poems of Firaq, and I chose a number of rubais from him, because Firaq's rubais are very, very different, and they make a class into themselves. But let me make a submission here. As a translator over the years, I have been saying about this at places, I have told about this. Do not lay your hands upon a text that you can't manage. Let me inform that I could not manage Firaq's rubai in translation. It's extremely difficult to translate Firaq. Just for example, another poet whom I wanted to take but couldn't, and that is Shafiq Fatma Shera, a woman poet. Extremely powerful poet. But how can one think even of translating a poet like Shafiq Fatma Shera? So rather than misrepresenting Faraq or Shafiq Fatma Shera, I chose, and with a heavy heart, not to take them. For me, that is my little consolation. Harpreet, I hope you are understanding what I mean. That is my little consolation, which is going to come in a few months' time. You will listen, and you will listen to her, and the way she is trying to understand that and how she is presenting it on this on the stage. Asim Saab talked about my crispness. What kind of a comment can I make on that crisp words? I understand, just to add to that point, I understand that translation is not complete and sufficient into itself unless you supplement the translation. So you have to introduce the poet. But I had a very limited space to do that, a page and a half maybe, or sometimes even a page, not beyond that. So I took that, that how do I supplement my translation? So that was my scope and that was my limitation, and that is how I did it. Sensitivity to the spoken language, you said it's Urdu. Urdu is very that way. We have to be very sensitive to the sound and patterns, and you have referred to the transliteration scheme that I have given at the end of the book. Fine. But what happens, unfortunately, and ironically enough, I would say that there is no standard transliteration key that you have in Urdu. Everyone develops, it seems. So if you look at Frances Pritchard's website, that's a very different kind of a scheme that she has. Or Professor C.M. Naim, he has a very different kind of a scheme, which I personally find it extremely difficult to follow. So I gleaned from several sources and finally tried to develop, because luckily there was no standard transliteration available to me. So I developed that and thought that probably that might make some sense. Because very rightly you said that Urdu is very sensitive that way to sound-wise. Suppose there is one confusion that goes in day in and day out in the way we speak these two words, dosto, bhaiyo, behno. It's so, how do I say, dosto meri baat suno, doston ne meri baat suni. Very few of us are in a position to distinguish. Urdu sounds are very particular about this. Urdu readers are very particular about this. Dosto meri baat suno. Listen to me, my friends. Dosto ne meri baat suni. My friends, listen to me. There is a difference. So the point that you made, Asim Saab, is very relevant. This auditory imagination, as Eliot calls it. So when I was trying to translate, I was very particular about two kinds of translational representation. One is how do I try to imitate this rhythm, the sound that is there in the poem that I'm translating? And what is the form of that poem? So I was trying to translate the form as well as the rhythm of that poem. And I personally understand that translating Urdu poetry is essentially a matter of translating the rhythm. If you do that, but that is a very tall order. I have no claims to that I have done anything very extraordinary or something which is remarkable, or even that will gain your attention at some point of time. I'm not about. Asim Saab, you said, I have taken only two poets from India, that is from the same university where you teach. And they are two very important poets that we have. But the third one, which I could not take, was Shafiq Fatma Shera. That was the only poet I could take from India. Because I personally think that when you have a limited number of pages and limited number of choices to make, you cannot go beyond that. So I couldn't. There are certain reasons which might come later to why so many women poets from Pakistan and not from India. Because the conditions there are such that they created this kind of great protest poetry that we have from them. Not looking at the Indian poets, and some people have also mentioned this earlier, and they agree with me in this respect. So I do not want to make further comments about how many, because my whole idea is not that how many poets from Pakistan and how many poets from India. My idea is that how many are the best poets that you have to represent without any consideration for the boundaries. So I was looking for the canonical voices, the important voices, not voices from whether they come from India or whether they come from Pakistan. My consideration was simple. Poets who have chosen the idiom of the tribe, as Mallarmé would put it, or those who have contributed to the making of a tradition and matured that tradition. So that was my criteria, and that is how I try to choose my poets and try to authenticate the tradition that they were trying to authenticate and put forward before my readers in the English language. Right, for at this stage, let me stop there so that we can go further if there are questions, and of course we can talk about translation. You have talked about some of the translations that you mentioned, Asim Saab. Very difficult to talk about the quality of translation. That is why probably we haven't talked about that, because it's very difficult to say that it's a good translation or a bad translation. And a good and a bad translation is all the time very subjective, and one has worked for years on that. My point was that I stopped at one particular point. I read it so many times and I thought this much and no further. I couldn't go beyond that in my revisions, so I stopped my hands on that. Harish Bhai referred in the beginning that 65 poets, when you superannuate, I don't like the word retirement. Super is a better word, superannuated people that we are. Asim Sahib, you are not still there, we are far, far away from it. My idea is that when you do these 65 poets, and there is a way beyond that. So beyond that, if you reach 70 and cross 70, which I have already done, so one is going to the canonical poets once again, and third thing that he's saying, ki bhai tum teesri two you have done, and where is the third one? So the hat trick he was referring to, yes, I'm laying my hands upon Ghalib, which everyone does. And who cares for Mir? So sad, really. No one bothers about Mir, who is the greatest of all the poets who ever wrote, including Ghalib. Mir was a far greater poet than Ghalib was. Just as Noon Mir Rashid was a far greater poet than Faiz Ahmad Faiz. Or Miraji was a far greater poet than Faiz Ahmad. But these are some of the misconceptions, maybe, some of the considerations that we need to take into mind. But I'm not going to speak further about that. So I have taken into consideration two things which I'm going to do now, which I'm almost about to finish, which is selected 200 popular and not so popular shares of Ghalib, which I have annotated in my own way. I'm going to put together in a volume. The book is called The Essential Ghalib. And the second one, which is in the pipeline, I must share that and reveal that no one has so far thought of Rekhti poetry in Urdu. It's the poetry written in the Urdu language by male in the female voice. I'm putting together an anthology of Rekhti poetry. That is all for now, and we can go further. Shraddhanjali, you can now open it up the way you wish.
Closure time for this discussion.
Yes, so this is still 8:30. So we were thinking if we could have one more round for another 15 minutes, then we could keep 15 minutes for discussions from other participants.
I'll try and confine myself then to 5 minutes so that we can all share out the time. Wonderful discussion, and wonderful to hear Anis talk about his work from his own point of view. I've always found that there is a kind of easy, natural modesty in Anis. And there is also, going with that, is a certain kind of elegance and sophistication. And all of these were on full display in the responses that he made, as they are indeed also in the books that he has translated. About 65 and 70 and Hazar and so on, I'm a little disappointed that from Hazar he has gone down to 200. But yeah, of course, that's because he's doing another kind of book. He's offering a detailed commentary and spelling out each nuance of those couplets, selected couplets. So that'll be another kind of flavor and another kind of enjoyment. About Sheen Kaf and about Urdu pronunciation, a point made by Siddiqui Sahab, what I'd like to say is that Urdu is popular because it is mispronounced. You know, if you insist on keeping Urdu to those who can pronounce it correctly, then right now 4.9% or 4.7% of the Indian population have registered themselves as speaking Urdu. Even out of them, half would be gone. So kindly be generous to those who can't pronounce Urdu. Lots of people would love to have these books and talk about them, and they will always say, Hajaro khwahishe. And you will have to put up with them. There's a novelist who wrote in Hindi, Manzoor Ehtisham. All his books print his name as Manjoor. What can you do? The huge majority is against you. So there are two ways, either of being a purist or of being popular. You can't have both. this also applies to another point. अरे क्या क्या बात आपने कही, खुदा जब हुस्न देता है तो उर्दू आई जाती है, जिन लोगों को उर्दू नहीं आती वो बहुत ही बदसूरत है. Everyone is ugly who doesn't know Urdu. Please don't say this outside the Urdu circles, because you may be in trouble. And you've also tried to create some trouble by raising the question of Hindu and Hindustan and Pakistan. I think you're going to cause a new conflict between the two countries by enumerating what's happening in Pakistan and why in the last section. I mean, there are many ways of looking at Urdu. Urdu is fraught with so is Bangla, but not in that way and not to that degree. They present another model. Urdu also has often been talked about in terms of Hindus and Muslims. It was a complete revelation to me when I read one of the early histories of Urdu literature by T. Graham Bailey, published 1928, in which one convenient thing that he did was, for all readers, that he numbered all the authors he had been discussing. And they came to about 220. And being a foreigner, he could talk about Hindus and Muslims rather more openly and frankly than we can, because we always feel a kind of a necessary constraint in handling these matters. And he said, out of these 220 authors, this number are Hindus. I'd invite you all to guess in the privacy of your own minds how many Hindus there were in that book, in that history of Urdu literature. Out of 220, there were 8. Now, that's one way of looking at it, but it's not to be recommended. Similarly, one must accept the fact that Urdu is not only spoken and written in Pakistan, but Urdu is the official language of Pakistan. Without Urdu, Pakistan would not have been created, according even to Jinnah, who didn't know Urdu. So let's accept these facts and then move on. And perhaps some of this is reflected as a necessary measure towards peace in these elections by Anis Bhai. Anis is perhaps promoting peace between the two countries by providing disproportionate representation to our poets from across the border. I'm filled with a sense that there is a tremendous richness in our literature, Indian literature, and that Urdu contributes more than its fair share to that richness and diversity and even complexity and sophistication of literary expression. As it happens, this is the 7th consecutive day on which I'm speaking about something or the other in public. In private, of course, I'm speaking even when I'm sleeping. But in public, 3 days consecutively, there was the Conference of English Studies, 100 years of English studies in India, in my own university, University of Delhi. Straight from that, I went to 3 days of a conference in Sarnath on the Buddha and poetry. And people were speaking Pali fluently and Tibetan fluently, and quoting from these languages, and copiously from Sanskrit, which even I would say that I'd be very happy if Urdu is given disproportionate representation among the languages of India when it comes to discussing this distinct and unique language and forms of expression, including the many varieties of Nazm. Thank you.
May I speak? Yeah. Sir, Trivedi Sahab, actually, when I was talking about that sentence, that was not a kind of general remark. That was a particular remark of Javed Akhtar, which was quoted by Muzaffar Ali with reference to Umrao Jan. And that was also, performance of Aishwarya Rai and Rekha. So,
neither Aishwarya Rai nor Rekha were
no.
born speaking Urdu.
Yeah, but
And if they were not under the director's whip, they would not be able to speak Urdu.
That's right. So
If there
actually-
were not on
Yeah.
stage somebody who insisted on their speaking correct Urdu, Telugu, Kannada and
So
Telugu.
actually, that remark actually should not be taken very seriously outside that context.
I have taken it very seriously. I have taken it to heart.
No, please. That is just very context. I mean, that was in particular context of that film, nothing else. And yeah. And the second thing is, actually, I agree with you that as far as Urdu pronunciation is concerned, sometimes Urdu walas are too particular. That means, I mean, sometimes they are too unforgiving, actually. So there I agree with you that it is not always necessary. And actually, the point can be made about English also. How many of us speak English the way Englishmen do? So I think there I perfectly agree with you. Okay. But of course, I mean, that first remark about Javed Akhtar, that is just confined to that context. Umrajan, nothing. Okay. I was making another point in the earlier round, Anisa's translation. So I actually had this particular passage, which is from Marcia, and I'm just reading a few lines. Ali's daughter wanders now, beating her bare head. On the other side, dear Ali's throat was cut, it bled. Though the wrongdoers kept Zainab from going ahead, she ran amok, holding her heart to where Hussein bled. She reached the site of slaughter, keeping all ignored. She saw his head hung on the tip of his sharp sword. Now, if you see the rhyme here, and that rhyme has been beautifully captured. And in fact, this is the kind of effect that you see in many other nazms also, which Anisa has translated. And since Harish Saab made a point about Firaq, and Anis Saab also gave that explanation that he found Firaq very difficult to translate. So one, in fact, question that came to my mind was it easier for him to translate modernist poetry? Say, for example, if you read that poem, I Am No Gautama, for example, by Khalil Rahman Azmi. So that kind of poem is very close to the original also, and many other modernist poems also. And he has actually translated many of those modernist poets, and they are very, very close. So was it easier to translate modernist poetry compared to classic modern poets? That celebration of Indian tradition, celebration of India, love of land, of course, from 16th century onward. And of course, I mean, many other things will come, but this is all now.
Shraddhanjali, before you open for question and answer, just a response, a very brief response to the two gentlemen who have spoken about. One thing I was clarify once again, let me reiterate it. I was not choosing countries at all. My position was to take the best of the voices that you have heard from both the country, the rhythm or capturing the auditory. I was trying to do two things together, especially when I was looking at the earlier poets, the traditional poets. My view is that when you ask this question, my view is that translating the classical poets up to 1930s, starting from Quli Qutub Shah and to Sauda, and you go on to Mir Taqi Mir and others. From there, coming to 1930s, from where the progressives come and take the scene to their convenience, so to say. So that portion was very difficult to translate, that part, from 16th century to 1920s, and even to, it was difficult. Because for two reasons. Because they were writing Paband Nazm mostly, and Paband Nazm has an end rhyme, and Paband Nazm has its own auditory kind of an impact that it makes on the reader. I was trying to capture that auditory imagination of the poet. I'm not sure how far I've been able to. You have quoted Mir Anis's Mercy. I've done it 100 times, revised that. Or, for example, one particular poem which I shared with Harish Bhai earlier, it's very difficult to translate that kind of rhythm. And as I said, let me reiterate once again, that when you translate Urdu poetry, you basically translate the rhythm of that particular form of the poem. So translation of the form and translation of the musical impact. So that is what I was trying to do. So form, of course, one enjoyed doing that and taking that challenge. Coming to the moderns, from the progressive writers to now, translating was a little easier. Well, it's never easy. Translation is never easy. But it was a little easier because I had no constraints of that form, of that kind of the formal structure, the end rhyme, because I wanted to take all that into consideration. When you come to the postmodernist and beyond postmodernism and postmodern, changed. It's a very different kind. It's as if you are just entering into a kind of a conversation with the poet. So translating that was a little easier for me, because it seems as if I'm engaging with the poet and I'm speaking with the poet and I'm trying to engage with the kind of experience that he's talking about. So translating that after 1940s or 50s, you can say, after the progressive or from progressive, broadly speaking, it was easier rather than taking Soda and Mir Hassan and Quli Qutub Shah, etc. That was very difficult, no doubt about that.
Thank you, Rehman sir. If I may request you, because we've had quite an detailed, intense discussion, but for people like us who are not familiar with Urdu poetry, if you could at least recite one of your translated.
Okay.
Before we
I agree with her. You have said the right thing. पिछले एक घंटे से तबसरा हो रहा है, जैसे हम पे बैठे हैं, एक के बाद दूसरे के बाद तीसरे के बाद, they are all narrating the history. अरे भाई, हम यहाँ पर पोइट्री का आनंद लेने आए हैं, इसलिए मेरी गुजारिश है अनीसर साहब से कि कुछ जो कहा ना आपने रंग, थोड़े से रंग तो दिखाओ उर्दू पोइट्री के. थैंक यू.
कि जादूपुर यूनिवर्सिटी में
जादूपुर यूनिवर्सिटी का ही रूप है नॉलेज. एक अपनी मुसरत की बात है और उसको हमें थोड़ा सा करना चाहिए. So I therefore endorse.
Yes. I understand what you mean and what Shandali wants me to read a few lines. I'll do that. It's a very experimental kind of verse. And I'm going back to Wali Dakkani. And Wali Dakkani, when did he write? That is in the 18th century. He died 1707. So lived towards the end of the 17th. And just a few couplets from there. This is called Mus. The first line is a question, a kind of a question. And the second line is an answer. So, Betab kiya shauq ne mujh dil ko badan mein gul pairahana ka. Then says, Jiu guncha kiya band mohabbat ke chaman mein rangi badana ka. Then the third, I will just not read more than that. मुझ दिल को नमन इश्क सू गर्दिश में हमेशा तन्हा नहीं खुर्शीद. So there is a question and there is an answer, a kind of an echo that you find in that second line. Three verses I have read. Let me go back to the translation. My passion kept my heart impatient in my body for that blossom being. My passion kept my heart impatient in my body for that blossom being. The second verse. The blossom remained unfurled in love's garden like the silent bright lips. And the third couplet, my love keeps my poor heart in a constant chase. It's not the sun alone. Sun alone is not chasing, but something else. This was from the classical poets. I will just read one, maybe because don't blame me that I'm reading from a poet from some other place, but let me just read that out so that you can get a glimpse of what is happening here. I read one poem by Sarwat Hussain. It's on 290. Sarwat Hussain taught in a university and in Karachi, and he committed suicide by throwing himself before a running train. And Sarwat is a very powerful poet, and I'm just reading one thing from him. Okay. I'm not reading the Urdu translation, I'm reading the English poem only. When the trees stood silent and the clouds made noise, I remembered you. When a woman raised a fire, I remembered you. When a child's funeral procession passed by a field, I remembered you. When the prisoner's van stood before the court, I remembered you. When people moved towards the prayer houses, I remembered you. When everyone in this world did one thing or the other, I remembered you. It's a very short poem by Sarvat Hussain. So,
Recite, I am no Gautama.
some knowledge and one day dawn upon me. The second stanza. But the body's fire I carried with me kept on burning. The wind blew hard outside. Its flames raged more, and every tree got burned to ashes. Where only I roam alone with my shadow, and the shadow of my shadow, and it's all void, far and wide. मैं गौतम नहीं हूँ. That is the poem that Khalilur reminds me. Azmi Sahab taught in the Department of Urdu at Aligarh Muslim University, one of the major poets that you have, and Urdu Department of AMU has produced some of the finest scholars and some of the finest poets that you have, starting from the progressive writers movement right to this day. You can take questions, Shraddhanjali, if you have time.
Yes, I think we can open for questions from the participants. Anyone can ask questions. Yes.
Abhijit Singh, Sarfaraz Anwar, and one more raised hands.
Yes. Yes.
Hello, good evening, sir. I'm Aqib Sabir. I'm assuming anybody can begin.
Yes, sure. Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Sir, actually, I have too many questions, but maybe I'll come with them to you sometime later. But,
Sure, you're welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
I mean, at this point, I'm just interested in what you said about the twin projects of Hazar Rang Shairi and Hazar Khwahishein Aisi, and you talked about these two ghazal and nazms as being traditions, of Urdu poetry. There, I have a slight, I should say, doubt that maybe you would help clear, because, sir, I'm aware that poetry from of Arabic poetry, from which Persian poetry and then Urdu poetry emerges, therein the primary genre is sher. That is the basic tradition, and because of that, nazm also happens to be a part of that tradition. And sher, and we already know that ghazal is a sort of a string of those ashar, right? So maybe I was just thinking.
Yes, I really appreciate the point that you are trying to make.
Yeah, so I was thinking just in connection with what Harish sir was saying, that maybe you could have a third sort of collection, which runs into lakhs. So possibly today we have nazm as one as one form, as we see it, ghazal as a form that we see it, and also sher if we go back to the classical form of differentiating between these different.
Yes, towards the end, actually, you have used a word called form, and by using that word, you have made my answer very easy for me. Of course, it's all poetry. It's all poetry. It's a particular kind of eloquence that makes it poetry. Fine, but that is not all. As the students of literature, and you have to hand over, maybe if you are doing some translation, you are not just doing it without any scheme or a plan. You have something in mind to say. Say, we have all studied in the schools and colleges, and some line of distinction, some classification, some kind of a bifurcation, some traditions that you have to think about, age-wise, individual. That is why I thought that this book should be done. So far, if you look at the books that are available with us, either you have individual poets' anthologies of translation, or you have a particular book in which you have the progressive writers put together. What I was thinking, I was trying to put together poetry of the nazm variety in this book and poetry of the ghazal variety in another book. And both the books taken together should give you some idea, idea of the trajectory right from the 16th century to now. But what you say is a very basic question. It's literature, it's poetry that we are engaging with. But when you engage with poetry, you give it a name. You give it a name. You identify that. You know the form. Now within the form also there are so many forms. I was talking of the auditory form, I was talking of the formal structure of and I was talking of so many things, the metaphorical form and how it appeals to the ear. There's a very important book on Herbert, the poem in the ear. So that is how you have to look at it. You can't just, that one has to look at. One has to classify, to see the forms, the genres, the development, the trajectory.
They all are fluent enough. I am from Urdu department of MB, so I am going to put my question in Urdu.
Zarur.
दो बातें थी. एक तो आपने ये जो किताब आपकी है वो मैंने पढ़ी, जाहिर है, और दैट वाज अ वेरी फैसिनेटिंग बुक. दो बातें मैं कहना चाहता था. अभी अपने एक नई किताब का तस्करा किया, द एसेंशियल गालिब, इफ आई हैव हर्ड दैट राइट. और मैं ये पूछ रहा था कि गालिब के यहाँ जैसी तो उसकी क्या परेशानियां हैं. एक जो वेस्टर्न ट्रेडिशन ऑफ फिलॉसफी है, उसको जाहिर है कि हमारे यहाँ की फिलॉसफी मुख्तलिफ है, और एक फिर जो बिल्कुल इंफरादी सतह की जो फिलॉसफी होती है. तो हाउ डू यू डील विद दैट व्हाइल ट्रांसलेटिंग?
सरफराज साहब, बहुत अहम सवाल पूछा है आपने, या गजल का ट्रेडिशन. लेकिन जाहिर है कि हम, आई कैन नॉट टेक लीव फ्रॉम द पर्शियन एंड द अरबिक ट्रेडिशन ऑफ ए पोएट्री टू व्हिच गालिब बिलोंग्स.
बात कही कि मीर गालिब से बड़े शायर हैं. जाहिर है कि फारूकी साहब ने ये तकरीबन एस्टैब्लिश कर दिया था शेर शोर अंगेज में, और अच्छी खासी.
दूसरी बात ये है, और हमारे समझ में आना चाहिए किसी.
Yes, Abhijit Singh, I can.
Please. Yes, Abhijit.
May I speak, ma'am?
Yes, please.
May I speak, sir?
Yes,
Good evening, professors. Adab. I'm Abhijit. I'm from Lucknow, and मैं बहुत डरा हुआ और बहुत नर्वस हूँ सर. मेरे मुंह से कुछ गलत निकल जाए तो माफ कीजिएगा. मैं आपका बहुत बड़ा फैन हूँ. मेरे दो छोटे सवाल हैं. पहला सवाल जो आसिम सर कह रहे थे, उस on the lines of that Urdu is a language in which poetry is very much dependent on language, और एक conversation